What? Why are you shaking your head?
You're welcome.
Hey guys, what is going on? It's week 16 cashing points. Graham Barfield is having some internet issues, so I will be your host. Ryan Heath is joining us. And as always, we have the wonderful HiLow. Tons to get into this week, so let's just dive right in. First game here, we can start off with the Philadelphia Eagles at the Washington Commanders. Eagles are 3.5-point favorites here. Total is 45.5. Biggest injury note here for fantasy is that Zach Ertz is questionable with a concussion. HiLow, I'll throw it over to you here. This is a pretty interesting game. Obviously, we know both of these teams can put up points. It's just a little tricky from a DFS perspective when, A.J. Brown, Saquon, Jalen Hurts, everyone's pretty expensive in this contest. What is your read here?
I don't think it's as messy as you're leading on. If we look at just like what the Eagles have done this season, Saquon Barkley has hit 29.7 DK points or more 6 times. Jalen Hurts has done that 6 times as well. So that's 12 out of their 14 games up. Either Jalen Hurts or Saquon Barkley has gone over like 29 points. So if you were to just say, like, coming into this game, we expect it to be competitive. We expect the Commanders to do something on offense. We don't know exactly. We don't have the best idea where that's going to flow. It's a bad matchup for Terry McLaurin. We have the issues with Zach Ertz. Noah Brown is out, but we can expect them to be competitive. So if we just come into the slate and say, if I went 50% Saquon Barkley and 50% Jalen Hurts, I would probably come out ahead if we could play this slate out 100 times. And that's kind of where I'm at. Like, I think they are, like, playing it that way. You're guaranteeing, or 12 divided by 14, whatever the hell that percentage works out to, 80 something percent. 80% of the time, you're going to have an elite score on your roster. Like, you're paying for it, but we can do some fun stuff to kind of work around that as far as salary. So I just think that either of those guys is highly likely to hit here. So I'll kind of be approaching this slate with this as kind of my starting point, to be honest.
Yeah, certainly think that's fair. Overall, I think the running back chalk is pretty strong this week, but if I am going to get different, I think Saquon is certainly one of my favorite ways to do so. Ryan, any interest here on the Washington side? How are you sort of viewing this game overall this week?
Yeah, most of my interest is on the Eagles side, mostly with Saquon Barkley. As you guys said, Commanders' biggest run funnel in the league. Would make some sense that after they kind of gave A.J. Brown his pass-heavy game last week, that maybe they get back to what they've been doing most of the season. Commander's side, it's just really tough. Like, I would rather do the contrarian stack from the Eagles side, I think, just because this matchup for Daniels and Terry McLaurin it is pretty much worst possible. Like, Eagles are bottom 5 in deep receiving yards per game allowed, stone worst matchup for opposing quarterbacks and outside wide receivers by schedule adjusted. So yeah, if I'm going the way of the expensive contrarian stack, it's probably going to be Hurts rather than from the Commander's side.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. A couple guys I wanted to mention, not really plays I'm particularly excited about, but we are really dry on value on this slate. Daimi Brown at 3,400 is a viable punt. Obviously, HiLow mentioned no Noah Brown in this contest. 78% route share, 3 targets last week for Daimi Brown. Ben Sinnott could be also argued as a punt, assuming Zach Ertz sits. He had a 67% route share in the second half last week without Ertz. Did only earn 1 target, though. Granted, at 2,800, it certainly opens up your lineup a bit, but I think we'd all just rather get up to Brenton Strange. All right, I think we covered this. You could, I think you could maybe argue also for Brian Robinson if Washington's able to pull off the upset here. Bottom 5 on paper matchup, but if we just look at the first halves of Robinson's games without Austin Eckler, he's averaged 23.4 fantasy points per 4 quarters. Obviously, he's gotten pulled later in a handful of those games. So paired with the Washington defense, I think that's viable. Not something I'm super excited about, but did want to mention that. All right, next game. This is a pretty fun one, I think. Detroit Lions at the Chicago Bears. Detroit, 6.5-point favorite. Total here is 48. Biggest injury note here for fantasy is that Roschon Johnson has cleared concussion protocol. He will play. This is a really interesting game from the Detroit side. Obviously, they're missing David Montgomery this week. We're going to get bell cow Jahmyr Gibbs. Part of me wonders, are the Lions going to go a little bit more pass heavy? I know Dan Campbell sort of hinted at we don't want to give Gibbs more work than he can handle. That might mean a few more pass attempts because I think we all know Craig Reynolds is not it. Ryan, I'll throw it over to you. How are you viewing Goff and this Lions passing attack? And then, obviously Jahmyr Gibbs is just a smash play in the spot.
Yeah, I'll start with Gibbs and just say that he's kind of clearly the best play on the slate, like straight up ownership ignored. And even with that, I think I just want to play a ton of Gibbs this week. If he had his like 70% of this backfield with his current efficiency, he'd be averaging almost 28 fantasy points per game. That's like Christian McCaffrey prime territory. It's just a clear smash spot for him. Awesome matchup. But I do think pretty much for that reason that it's very interesting to stack up this Lions passing game. Goff 7th in fantasy points per drop back this year. The 2 games that they've lost, Goff has gone up to an average of 57 pass attempts per game. As you mentioned, with Montgomery out, if the Lions do decide to lean pass heavy for whatever reason, either because they're being pushed or because that's just how they feel they can best attack this without Montgomery, then there's massive upside. For your Amon-Ra St. Brown, the Bears have been a slot funnel in recent weeks. And I also am pretty interested in Sam Laporta within the context of game stacks. It's a great schematic matchup for him. The Bears play a ton of single high, and Laporta has always been about double as efficient against single high over his career. His volume is actually coming up. His role's getting better in the past several games. Season high in targets in back-to-back games, 7 the week before, 10 last week. So I do think there's some juice there with the Goff stacks. But ultimately, it's kind of just this huge leverage play on Gibbs and then on what will be very popular stacks coming from the other side of this game.
Yeah. I think that's pretty close to where I'm at too. Also wanted to throw out Jamison Williams as a potential for game stacks. Bears are a deep funnel, 9th most receiving yards per game on throws traveling at least 20 yards downfield, but the 3rd fewest on throws within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage. HiLo, the other side of this game is projecting to be very popular. I think it's pretty clear at this point that Caleb Williams plus DJ Moore plus Keenan Allen will be the most popular double stack of the slate. I think most people, and whether it's content or just myself sort of talking with my coworkers here at Fantasy Points, most people sort of anticipate that Rome Odunze will end up being a fairly popular pivot off of that chalk double stack. He's a guy that I certainly like quite a bit in this game right now. Across the industry, projected for like 1% ownership. I certainly expect that to come up a decent bit. How are you viewing the Bears side of this game and this game overall?
Yeah, I'll start with this game overall. This is like, now that we had Jameis against Joe Burrow ripped away from us, like this could be one of the top game environments on the slate. And I'm kind of approaching it through that lens. First of all, for Jahmyr Gibbs, we have Dan Campbell on Tuesday who said, we need to be cognizant of his workload. He's our lightning guy. We don't want to overwork him. That's fantastic until you get punched in the mouth. And we have to realize that this team they have the inside track, they have command of the 1 seed. They also have 20 defensive injuries. If you compare where their roster is now to where it started in week 1, 20 players are missing from that depth chart. So they are banged up. A playoff bye probably means a little bit more to the Lions than it would a team that is healthier, like the Eagles, like the Vikings. So to me, this team has Super Bowl aspirations. They want to they know they're going to be without David Montgomery. They want to manage Jahmyr Gibbs. But what happens when the game is on the line? Is it going to be, we're going to trot out 45% Craig Reynolds, or we're going to have Jahmyr Gibbs on the field for 80% of the snaps? It's probably the latter. So we don't have a game this season where they have played without one of Jahmyr Gibbs or David Montgomery. But we did have 5 games last season with that setup. I'll go through it real quick. David Montgomery missed 3 games early in the season. It was week 3, 6, and 7. Gibbs held snap rates of 60%, 87%, and 70% with opportunity counts of 19, 21, and 31 in those games. In the 2 games Jahmyr Gibbs missed, Montgomery saw snap shares of 71%, 75%. So it is clear to me that that's kind of the baseline expectation for Jahmyr Gibbs here. 70 to 75% of the offensive snaps. If a game remains close, it's probably going to be higher. So how does the game remain close? Well, we have Thomas Brown now, who first took over the offensive coordinator position and then took over the interim head coach position for the Bears. And if you look at how they performed since he took over, which was week 11, their two highest pass rate over expectation games came since that time. Week 12 and week 13. And who did they play? They played the Vikings and they played the Lions. So to me, this is a spot where Thomas Brown, he has been an interim offensive coordinator before in Carolina. He got another chance to do so this year. Now he has a chance to kind of plead his case as the interim head coach. To me, they come out firing. Like, he's playing for a future job. We have Caleb Williams, who they're playing to keep the band together. They're playing to figure out what they're going to do moving forward in the future. So yeah, dude, I love me some Caleb Williams. I love double stacking him primarily with Keenan Allen and DJ Moore. If you look at those 2 games that I mentioned, week 12 and week 13, Keenan Allen and DJ Moore combined for 22 targets and 24 targets. And if you add up the fantasy scores of Caleb Williams, DJ Moore, and Keenan Allen in those games, they kept you on a 250-point pace. So a 5x salary multiplier. So I'm like, yeah, dude, I don't care if they're going to be on 8% of rosters. I can just play like Saquon Barkley with Jahmyr Gibbs, and it doesn't matter anymore. So there are some smart ways to differentiate away from the chalk here.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's important to keep in mind when we are talking about chalky double stacks is, if you like it, you can certainly play it. You just need to make sure to get a little different elsewhere. Certainly do like Keenan Allen and DJ Moore, both top values for us since Thomas Brown took over. They've both been pacing as top 12 wide receivers, but I did want to make a quick case for Rome Odunze. He leads the league in end zone targets since the offensive coordinator change, also ranks 7th in air yards over that span. Obviously is underproduced because he leads the league in uncatchable air yards since Thomas Brown took over as the offensive coordinator. But hey, Caleb Williams hits him on a couple of those deep balls, and I think we'll forget all about that. So certainly worth looking at for tournaments. I think we did a pretty good job covering this game. I'd imagine neither of you guys have any interest in DeAndre Swift, given that Roshan Johnson is back. Yeah. All right. Before we move on, producer Thomas wanted me to mention that if you missed a game, please be sure to check the timestamps and you can go back live and check all that out. So definitely give that a look if you are joining late. All right. Moving on to our next game here. Cleveland Browns at the Cincinnati Bengals. Browns are 8.5-point underdogs. Total here is 46.5. Obviously, we were robbed of Jameis Winston against the Bengals here. It's going to be DTR. Starting on the injury front, David Njoku is dealing with a hamstring. Cedric Tillman is still in concussion protocol. Both are questionable. Coach speak seemed a little bit more favorable on Njoku going. And then T. Higgins was on the injury report earlier in the week. He's now off and is good to go. I really can't say that I have much interest in the Browns side here. I do think the Bengals side of this game is really, really interesting. We can start with Chase Brown because I think that's a layup. Brown's workload is easily the best in football right now, 22% more valuable than Alvin Kamara's workload. It's a bottom 3 matchup, but Brown has seen his fantasy points per snap jump almost 60%. While leading throughout his career. Obviously, Bengals heavy favorites here. Bengals pass game, I think, is more of an interesting discussion with obviously Joe Burrow, Chase, and Higgins all projecting pretty well. We all know they have great upside. Ryan, I'll throw it over to you. What are your thoughts on this Bengals passing attack against a single high heavy Browns defense?
Yeah, I have to be interested in Jamar Chase against any sort of single high heavy matchup. So basically, most teams will not play majority single high against the Bengals for exactly this reason. They don't want to get burned by Chase. It's happened 5 times this year. In those 5 games, Chase is averaging 29 DraftKings fantasy points per game, almost 120 receiving yards per game. In 2 of the 5, those were the ones where he went over 44 DraftKings points per game. So the ceiling here is very obvious. Now, of course, the Bengals have to maybe somewhat get pushed. I do think they're going to come out aggressive regardless. They lead the league in pass rate over expectation. Every game for the Bengals is a must-win game for them to keep any semblance of playoff hopes alive. So I do think they'll come out swinging. And again, because this Browns defense is a bit easier to pass on than to run on, that adds some to that as well. So yeah, definitely have some interest in the Joe Burrow, in the Jamar Chase stacks. I do think in terms of thinking about how they could get pushed, if we're looking for a bring back from the other side of this game, which I think it makes sense to do, David Njoku is by far the most interesting to me. In Dorian Thompson-Robinson's 3 starts last year, Njoku was averaging 10.3 targets per game, 18 expected fantasy points per game. Obviously, both of those would easily lead the position this year. In the DTR game earlier this year, which was the Bengals-Browns previous matchup, Njoku had 14 targets. Bengals have been a sieve, 2 tight ends, allowing the second most schedule adjusted fantasy points per game. So I think if anyone pushes them, it's probably Njoku. So he's my clear bring back that I want to get onto. Not that interested in any of the Jerome Ford stuff, but that's really how I'm attacking this game.
Yeah, Ford was a guy I was pretty excited about when I thought Jameis Winston could start. Obviously he sees a snap share and overall usage really tick up when the team is trailing. But with DTR starting, I'm really not too tempted by it. HiLo, how are you viewing this game? What are your thoughts on the Bengals here?
Yeah, man, I was like all excited to build around this game until
I think we all were.
it was ripped from us, dude. Dorian Thompson-Robinson has been one of the, if not the least efficient quarterbacks. I have to double check that. You guys probably fact check me on that.
I mean, he was a 5-star recruit who was bad in college and is bad in the NFL. Like, he's just never shown anything really.
Yeah. And it's just one of those instances where I don't have any interest in the Browns just based on who they have under center. And that makes it a more difficult, like it narrows the path. We've talked about it, like the paths to fantasy, it's like stardom or relevancy or GPP viability. It narrows the paths for the Bengals as well. If they are able to just like, if the Browns can't move the ball, like the Bengals aren't going to be forced to, like, they're not going to go out and try and win 42-3 like this. They need to keep winning, but they also need to stay healthy. They also need to protect Joe Burrow. So there's just fewer paths to this game opening up. And like when we compare like directly, like Jamar Chase versus some of these other wide receivers at the high end of the pricing tier, or compare Jamar Chase, who's 8,500, to Saquon Barkley, who's 8,300, there's just better places I would rather go.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think especially, as a flex play, comparing him to Barkley, I think is a really sharp, or even Bijan Robinson. I'd just much rather play those guys here. Of course, it is Jamar Chase. I mean, this is a guy who can pretty easily score 50 points. Part of me kind of thinks the Bengals just won't take their foot off the gas. They're just going to throw 70% of the time, no matter what, because they really can't afford to lose any more games down the stretch here. But I do think there are overall better spots on this slate to go. I'll still play a little bit of Burrow, though. I always do. All right, I think we covered that game pretty well. We can move on to the Los Angeles Rams at the New York Jets. Rams are 3.5-point favorites. Total here is 46.5. Only fantasy injury of note is that Braylon Allen is dealing with a back issue. He's questionable, so that might be worth a slight boost to Breece Hall. This seems like a pretty strong spot for Matthew Stafford double stacks. HiLo, I'm really curious what your thoughts are here. This Jets defense has been much more vulnerable against the pass than they were last season. Sauce Gardner's played through some injuries. Their slot cornerback, Michael Carter, has been hurt a ton this season. This really isn't a secondary to shy away from. And, like we've talked about week after week, this Rams team is sort of just like the Bengals light, where it's highly concentrated. We know exactly where the volume's going to go. And it really doesn't seem like a lot of people want to play these Stafford doubles this week. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, if we look at like the Jets, it's really been a tale of two seasons defensively. And where that changed was with the firing of Robert Saleh. If we just look at the snapshot over the last 3 weeks, they've allowed 263.7 pass yards per game. Just a quick comparison, like I don't like extrapolating, but like when there's a very clear identifier or a signal of why that change happened, it becomes a little bit more viable to extrapolate like this. But if we extrapolate that over the full season, it would rank 31st in the league, ahead of only the Jacksonville Jaguars at 264.3 pass yards allowed per game. So they are fundamentally and structurally playing different football now, which makes sense when you fire your head coach, when you change offensive coordinators, when you do all this stuff that they've done. And they try and save it by like a last ditch Hail Mary of bringing in like another one of Aaron Rodgers' boys. But all of that to say, like, this game very clearly has the paths to upside. The Jets have also been passing with greater frequency of late. So when we get those two pieces, we also have to like look at that within the context of how does this game get to that level? We know that Sean McVay, we know who he is. We know that he is one of the most adaptable head coaches in the league, and he's not really looking to come into games and like run up 28 points in the first quarter or 28 points in the first half, whatever the case may be. So he probably needs to get pushed to have Matthew Stafford throwing the football more than 28 to 32 times. Like, that doesn't matter as much for Puka, but that matters a lot if we're considering Stafford doubles. So to me, the clearest, like the likeliest scenario from this game is that like Puka puts up a good game. One of Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson puts up a good game. Outside of that, so I prefer attacking this game through like a skinny correlation, like Puka plus Garrett Wilson or Devontae Adams. Then I do trying to force one of these quarterbacks in, because I think the avenues for it to turn into something that like you could not win without flow through the Jets. And that's kind of a scary proposition here.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I do think this is a game where I will certainly want to use run backs. I really like that skinny stack. I think that's particularly sharp. One note on Puka, this is from Scott Barrett's Slate breakdown. Jets are a slot funnel, which would normally favor Cooper Kupp. The Rams jacked up Nakua's slot rate to a season high 63% 2 weeks ago against Buffalo's slot funnel defense. So, he's a pretty clear alpha, and it seems like they're going to put him in positions to win. That said, I do still have a little bit of interest in Kupp, even though he's, pretty clearly the number 2 here. He's at his cheapest price point since week 2 of 2021. So this is a pretty significant discount on Cooper Kupp, worth considering at the very least. Ryan, I'll throw it over to you. What are your thoughts on this game, and how do you want to attack the Jets side, who, also highly condensed, also has a pretty decent matchup here?
Yeah, I think for me with this game, I'm viewing it a little bit differently. I think it can either very much go off, in which case I want probably a double stack with Stafford and a bring back, or I think it can just be kind of terrible. So I mean, you guys have done a decent job of talking about these matchups and how these offenses are condensed and how this game could go off. But obviously, on the other end, both of these teams rank as top 5 run funnels by PROE allowed. The Rams have been very, very run heavy over the past 3 weeks, averaging nearly a negative 12% pass rate over expectation, which is twice as run heavy as the Eagles have been over the full season, for context. So if they don't get pushed, the Rams are just going to pack it in. They're going to run Kyren Williams. They are 3.5 point favorites. That's likely going to be kind of the default that they come out in. So, I think pretty much no matter what, if you're stacking this game, you need Devontae Adams in the lineup, whether it's as a stacking piece or as the bring back. Since week 9, Adams leads all players in target share, seeing at least 11 targets in 3 straight games. Obviously, just dropped 45 DraftKings points last week, 29 the week before. I am also kind of interested in the narrative that Aaron Rodgers is just trying to get Devontae Adams a bigger contract for next season because his contract is like non-viable after this year. He's going to get cut and will have to get signed to something else by a different team. So I think it's very clearly Adams, both in terms of the fantasy production and the way the volume's been leaning away from Garrett Wilson. There was that clip of Wilson screaming at Adams or at Rodgers on the sideline during the last game. So Adams is my clear lean. And as I said, it's hard to imagine this game going crazy without Adams going crazy.
Yeah, I'm not one to walk down narrative street, but Aaron Rodgers is a quarterback who is known to hold some grudges. After that sideline tirade by Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams had a 43% target share. Wilson had a meager 10% target share. That said, I mean, Garrett Wilson still 19.2 expected fantasy points per game over the last month. I believe that would be wide receiver 2 over the full season. So there is still some juice there. I don't know if I'd go quite as far as saying you have to play Devontae Adams, but I'm pretty close. I'm going to want Devontae Adams on a lot of my game stacks here. I think we did a good job on this one. We can move along to the New York Giants at the Atlanta Falcons. New York, 8.5 point underdogs. Total here is 43. Major injury note here is that Tyrone Tracy is questionable with an ankle injury. Hilo, obviously, we have to start it off by talking about the slate's best value at quarterback. I think pretty clearly the cash game quarterback this week in Michael Penix. He's dirt cheap, facing a Giants defense that ranks as a top 10 on-paper matchup since week 11. New York has also allowed the third most deep receiving yards per game. Penix threw deep on 21% of his attempts in his final college season. Shout out to Ryan for that poll. Hilo, what are your thoughts on Penix and Atlanta overall? Because they have been very run heavy. I do wonder if part of that is because of Cousins' lack of mobility. That said, this is a rookie quarterback in his first game. So I'm really curious how you're viewing this.
Yeah, I think it's just a wide range of outcomes. I mean, I'm not going to pretend to know which side of the fence the Falcons will fall on. They very clearly have been extremely run heavy over their last 4 games, the most run heavy team in the league. Is that a change in mentality? Is that a change like that their offense is just struggling and they're trying to hold on to hope for the playoffs? I don't know. We also have to have the discussion of like who Michael Penix is. And if I'm sitting on the sidelines just as a casual observer of what's happened, this team is very well within the division discussion for the lead. They need to win out effectively. Now they've dropped a game. They've dropped 4 of their last 5 games. They had a 2-game lead over the Buccaneers with the tiebreaker in hand just 5 games ago. And now they're a game back. So, but if I'm looking at the situation for like a casual observer from the sideline, they have to have seen something in Michael Penix to say he gives us the best chance to win right now. This is they're not a team that has packed it in. They are playing for the postseason. So whether this continues into this run heavy ways or whether we see them trust Penix to be throwing the football around again, at least be like a run balanced team, I don't know. I really don't. So to me, that uncertainty is anti-cash game. To me, it is much better to say, I can get certainty through Caleb Williams doubles, or I can get certainty through Jalen Hurts, as opposed to this guy's cheap and he probably scores 12 points. Like that's not necessarily what we're kind of looking to do in cash games. There is a ton of uncertainty there. So for me, he's more of a GPP only play. And then it becomes, do you have to? So like this discussion is like 5 layers deep. We're on like layer 4 right now. Then it becomes like, do I have to stack him with somebody? It's like, I don't know. I don't know, dude. I don't know if you have to. So there's just a lot of uncertainty here to the point where like, I don't see myself going there in cash. I would rather get like certainty from Jalen Hurts or certainty from Caleb Williams, which allows me to play Saquon Barkley. Like you can play, like Penix will allow you to play Saquon Barkley in another pay up option. But I just think that like, if we just compared Jalen Coker, who's 4,200, like I think Jalen Coker plus Jalen Hurts is probably a higher median than Michael Penix plus a Saquon Barkley. Well, I don't know. That's probably an interesting discussion. A little bit more salary is required to get to Saquon. So I don't know. It's kind of my final answer. It's more of a stay away, I think, for cash for me.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I will say I think Penix is pretty clearly the cash quarterback, if only because we're so light on value across the board. And, I think especially paying up for 3-7K running backs or, Saquon Barkley, as Hilo mentioned, feels like a pretty strong build as I was playing around with lineups. Ryan, I'll throw it over to you. What are your thoughts on Penix? Again, I'm sort of in the Hilo camp. Obviously, none of us can really know for sure. I think there's sort of 2 different ways you could play this. You could single stack Penix. I don't know if I'd go quite as far as a double, but I do think obviously viable for tournaments. And then there's Bijan Robinson, who pretty much profiles as a great play regardless. 22 carries in 3 straight games. And, like I said, Atlanta ranks as the league's most run-heavy team by pass rate over expectation since week 10. Ryan, what are your thoughts on the Atlanta side here?
Yeah, I think Robinson is decent, but I will say, kind of as we've mentioned already on this show, that the running back chalk is very, very good. I think Robinson is kind of a tier below like the best running back chalk on this slate. Yeah. Obviously, great matchup. Giants 8-point favorites. All that's amazing. I will say, just as like a concern, we have seen Robinson play less generally when the Falcons have a lead. His snap share is down to about 51% when the team is leading. If they kind of choose to go this very run-heavy route, we've seen Tyler Algier be more involved kind of throughout the game over each of these last 3 or 4 games where that's been the approach. So I don't know if the ceiling is huge for Robinson necessarily, or at least as big as you might think just from looking at the matchup on paper. As far as Penix, I think I do want to single stack him in tournaments. Just to play into, we're making the assumption that the Falcons are going pass heavy and kind of letting him sling it. But as far as who that's with, yeah, it's pretty tough. I think my ultimate lean is Drake London. But I will say, and this is super gross, super galaxy brain, will I actually don't tail me, basically. But Kyle Pitts does have an incredible schematic matchup. The Giants deploying a ton of single high looks. Pitts has pretty much only been productive against single high at all this year. So he's about 150% more efficient by yards per route run against those looks. Last week, he led the team in target share, had his highest route share since week 7. It's a rough on paper matchup. The Giants don't allow a lot to opposing tight ends, but I don't think anyone's playing Kyle Pitts. And I do think a lot of people are playing Michael Penix. So just leaning into the uncertainty, maybe Pitts is just kind of randomly Michael Penix's guy. I like that. I don't like playing Kyle Pitts, but I like kind of the play from a theoretical perspective.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting angle, especially if you're making like a 150 set for a milli or a similarly sized tournament, because, you know, like Ryan said, we don't really know who Penix's guy could be. I'm always a little bit more privy to Darnell Mooney, but I think in my Penix teams, I'll kind of mix and match throughout. Might end up with a couple doubles, but mostly single stacks across the board there. Need to talk Giants really quick. I really don't have much interest in Tracy with how strong the running back position is looking overall. Malik Neighbors, though, is seeing like truly elite volume, leads all players at all positions in expected fantasy points per game. Even if we just look at the last 5 weeks, which are all games without Daniel Jones, Neighbors is the overall wide receiver 2 by expected fantasy points per game. And Atlanta ranks as the second softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing wide receivers since week 9. I think, you know, pretty safe to say there's no world where he should be 6,100. That said, it looks like he's going to clock in with some pretty notable ownership here. And that does scare me off a bit, especially with Drew Lock as his quarterback, only 13.6 catchable expected fantasy points per game in his 2 games with Drew Lock. Ryan, what are your thoughts on Neighbors? He's a guy that I think I've sort of settled on. I want to be underweight the field, but I don't want to fade entirely because the volume is just so damn good.
Yeah, you covered most of what I was going to say, and I largely align with you. The volume's great. It's just very tough to play anyone on this offense, especially at ownership. Like I would be fine with it were he not projecting for the highest ownership of any wide receiver. It's just kind of difficult. I guess the one thing I'll add is that the Giants have only thrown for a touchdown in 2 of their last 9 games. So that just scares me off a lot. I don't think you have to bring back if you're playing Penix at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a very fair call. Always hard to eat a guy who could be 25, 30% owned in small fields when that offense has only thrown for 2 touchdowns in the last 9 games, which is a truly absurd stat. All right. I think we did solid there. We can move on to Arizona at Carolina. Cardinals are 4.5 point favorites. Total here is a surprisingly high 47. Couple injury notes on the Arizona side. Trey Benson is out. Amari DiMercado is on IR, and DJ Dallas is listed as questionable with an illness. We almost always see players fight through the illness designation, but for all intents and purposes, it's going to be the James Conner show this week. On the Carolina side, Xavier Legette is out. David Moore is questionable with a concussion, and Jalen Coker is questionable with a quad issue. I think Coker goes. I'm pretty unsure about David Moore. We can cover James Conner really quick. I'd imagine we're all on a pretty similar page here. Led all running backs in usage last week. He draws a best possible matchup against a Panthers defense that is allowing a league-leading 173 rushing yards per game and a league worst 5 yards per carry. Cardinals are 4.5 point favorites here. Like I mentioned, Conner 45% more productive in wins compared to losses this season. Really don't need to tell you guys to play running backs against the Panthers, especially when the running back is projected for, effectively every carry and especially every high value backfield touch. Hilo, I'll throw it over to you. How are you sort of viewing this game? I'm seeing, some people want to play Kyler Murray. To me, the Cardinal side is mostly just James Conner Trey McBride. And then, there are a couple interesting salary saving options on the Carolina side, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, man. First off, like, Panthers have been playing better football of late. They've been playing better defense. They've been much more competitive in games. So to me, that is a boost to the expected usage of the primary skill position players of the Cardinals. With all the injuries, James Conner should see, and like, I don't know how high his workload is going to get. We look at his like production to date and his workload to date. He's highly likely to see like 18 to 22 opportunities. He's seen rather consistent pass game involvement. 4 to 5 targets is kind of his median. At the same time, he has one game over 22 opportunities this season, and that was just 24 opportunities. So like, while he is extremely likely to hit like 18 to 22 opportunities, he's probably extremely unlikely to see like 26 to 28, which would be like massive ceiling type discussion. On the other, or on that same side of that discussion, like, this is a guy that is still going to require 100 yards and multiple scores in order to sink you for not playing him because of his price. Like, he's got to hit 28 to 32 fantasy points. Or else, like, he can be a piece that you can win without. You can work around, you can build a roster in different ways. And last week was really the first time where we saw that type of ceiling from him this season. His season high before last week was 22.4 DK points. So I'm a little bit like, he is like a good on paper play just because the matchup, they don't expect to have bodies behind him. Like, DJ Dallas could go, they could bring in Michael Carter off the practice squad. So they'll have somebody behind him. So I just don't know, like, he's very clearly like a tier, maybe tier and a half behind like Jahmyr Gibbs and Saquon Barkley. He's probably in the same range for me as Bijan Robinson. Like, workload is locked in, highly unlikely to burn you. That's kind of how I'm seeing him. So I think I'm a little bit against the grain in that view.
Yeah, I certainly think that's fair analysis. I am a little bit more bullish on Connor. Arizona only a 13% chance to make the playoffs. So obviously this is a game they need to win. I don't think anyone would be surprised if Connor came out of this game with a 90% snap share and, damn near every backfield touch. Ryan, what are your thoughts on the Arizona side of this game? Anything to add on Connor before we talk about some of these Carolina values?
I think Connor's a really strong play. Just kind of every matchup indication is really good. We did just see him hit a big ceiling last week. The only team that has been a softer schedule adjusted matchup against the run than the Patriots is this Panthers team, and they're about twice as soft. So I'm fine with playing Connor in tournaments. He's definitely below Gibbs for me, but not somebody I'm going to be fading. As far as the rest of the Cardinals, just not a ton of interest in Kyler Murray. The Cardinals have been spiking up their pass rate over expectation the last few weeks, but it just hasn't really mattered for Murray. It's hard for me to like really get on board with Kyler Murray ever. I do think Trey McBride is a pretty strong play. The schematic matchup is excellent for him. The Panthers play a ton of cover 3. McBride is averaging about a 32% target share against cover 3 this year. That is second best among all receivers behind only Justin Jefferson, over 3 yards per out run against it. All that stuff's great. Panthers also very soft by schedule adjusted fantasy points to opposing tight ends. They're throwing to him in the end zone, 4 end zone targets over his last 5 games. I know Kyler has been talking about wanting to get him a touchdown. It's become like a narrative in the locker room now. It seems like it's kind of has reached the team that it's ridiculous Trey McBride hasn't scored a touchdown yet. This could definitely be the week for it. So I do think McBride is pretty strong. And then I guess on the Panthers side, my real like bone to pick, or my biggest take, is that I think Adam Thielen as a play is just way better than Coker, especially straight up, but also if you factor in ownership. It's definitely easy to click Coker when you're building to make a lot of stuff work. But this Cardinals defense kind of just funnels everything to where Thielen is. They're a big slot funnel. They're a big underneath funnel. Thielen was still above a 70% route share in the slot last week, 30% target share on throws within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage. That's just kind of what the Cardinals are letting teams do. And Thielen seems the most likely to take advantage of that. So I really like Thielen as a value. It works as leverage kind of on Coker as well. So that's kind of my two biggest takes here.
I will add there also that Jalen Coker did see 50% of his routes from the slot last week as well. I was kind of interested to see how they would coexist because Coker was almost like exclusively used from the slot without Adam Thielen. And last week was the first game where they've been on the field together this season. And it was interesting because Jalen Coker saw 50% slot snap rate. He was in a route 83% clip, which was only 5% less than Adam Thielen. So to me, like the potential savings could justify the ownership, but and even like in that discussion, the ownership isn't overly crazy on Coker. I think either are viable. Just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, I'm with you. And then we do need to quickly talk about Chuba Hubbard, who is projecting for, depending on where you look, 4th, 5th-ish most running back ownership on the slate. 19 fantasy points per game on a 21 expected fantasy point per game workload in the 6 games the Panthers haven't lost by multiple scores. Averages just 12.3 fantasy points per game on 12.8 expected fantasy points per game in all other games. To me, Hubbard is effectively a leveraged bet that Carolina isn't a total disaster offensively. Pretty clearly in a tier down from some of the other running back plays we've discussed, but still pretty solid here if Carolina can keep pace. Hilo, where are you at on Chuba Hubbard this week? Oh, he's muted.
Damn sickness got me muted when I have to cough. There's just so many better plays on paper. Yeah. I don't think you have to go there. I'd much rather prefer going to James Conner, and I'm below consensus on James Conner. So there's just so many good running back plays this week.
Yeah, I think I'm there with you. I still want a little bit of Hubbard exposure. I think my favorite way to do it is to pair him with the Carolina defense. If Carolina shows up, this could certainly be a decent game for Chuba. All right, covered everything there. We can move on to Tennessee at Indianapolis. Tennessee, 3.5-point underdogs. Total here is 42. Injuries. Tony Pollard is questionable with an ankle issue. He has not practiced all week. Alec Pierce is also out on the Indianapolis side with a concussion. Ryan, I think on the Tennessee side, obviously, we can say for certainty here, if Tony Pollard is out, Tajay Spears is going to jump into, the Jahmyr Gibbs tier of running back plays. I believe he's only 4,900 on this slate, which would just be ridiculously cheap for a guy who, could push for 18 to 20 touches. Beyond that, I certainly have some interest in Calvin Ridley and a little bit in Chig Okonkwo, mostly because I read your article, Ryan. Ridley, though, I'm surprised he's not pulling more ownership. This is a guy who projected as a strong value and was popular in several weeks with Will Levis and just never really got there because Levis can't throw him catchable air yards. Mason Rudolph probably can. What are your thoughts on Ridley and Okonkwo here?
Yeah, let's start there. I'm also a little surprised that the Ridley ownership looks fairly under control. In 9.5 quarters with Mason Rudolph under center since they traded Hopkins, so since it's just been Ridley as the guy, Ridley is averaging about 11 targets, 17 fantasy points per game, and over 20 expected fantasy points per game per 4 full quarters, if we just extrapolate that to roughly a per game rate. That those would be second best, ninth best, second best among wide receivers this season. Yeah, he's a clear value there. Obviously, this is Calvin Ridley. There is volatility here. That this is a GPP only type of play for me, I think. But yeah, I think that is pretty strong. And then with Okonkwo, I guess most importantly, Mason Rudolph has just targeted Okonkwo a lot more than Levis has. Target per out run jumps from 14% up to 22% with Mason Rudolph. It's also an ideal schematic matchup for Okonkwo. The Colts deploying a lot of cover 3. Chig about 30% more efficient against cover 3 over the last 2 years. So yeah, there's like some kind of interesting one-off plays here. I would much rather, of course, go to Brenton Strange than to a Chig Okonkwo. But yeah, stuff to think about at least on this side of the matchup.
Yeah, certainly worth thinking about. Hilo, on the Indianapolis side here, Anthony Richardson is projecting for massive ownership. This is a guy we've obviously seen extreme volatility from Richardson. So I'm generally leaning into the play when no one wants to play him. But geez, I mean, if he's going to be 15 to 20% owned, I'm going to have a really hard time playing a guy who, sure, he's the greatest athlete to ever play the position, but as a passer, he isn't that much different than Tim Tebow right now, based on his completion percentage and, sort of all those underlying metrics. What are your thoughts on Anthony Richardson and the Colts side of this game?
Yeah, I think a lot of that ownership is also due to his passing or his stacking partners being so cheap.
Yeah.
Like Adonai Mitchell stepping into the Alec Pierce role. Like Adonai Mitchell has kind of been the jack of all trades. Like when Josh Downs was out, he went into the slot. When Michael Pittman was out, he entered the perimeter role, and he has the skill set to be like a downfield guy as well. So I think he just enters the Alec Pierce role. He's only 3,800. Josh Downs is back from injury. He's only 4,900. So like these stacking partners being so cheap with a quarterback that's already very cheap that has proven upside. And now he's like running more in his second stint as under center. So I get it. At the same time, I am mostly in line with you, where this team has been top 4 in rush rate over expectation. So bottom 4 in pass rate over expectation since Anthony Richardson came back under center. And so we're effectively betting on splash plays. So can that happen through Josh Downs? Maybe. Can that happen through Adonai Mitchell? Maybe. Is it very likely that we see Jonathan Taylor heavily involved? Probably. So I'm with you. I do want to backtrack a minute. That's my Colts thoughts. I do want to backtrack a minute and talk about Chig because everyone's going to see his 10 target game last week. And I don't know if everyone's going to realize that 7 of those 10 targets came from Mason Rudolph after entering the game. And he played only about 53% of the offensive snaps. This season, Mason Rudolph has a 28% tight end target rate, and the team average this season is 22%. So this is like a spot, like, yeah, he's a inferior on paper play to a guy like Brenton Strange, just because Brenton Strange is going to be an 85% snap rate player. Chigakonkwo has been like meandering around between like 70% and 55%. So there's uncertainty there. But if you look at how this team has performed against cover 3, which is important because the Colts are 3rd in cover 3 utilization, 41.7%. Calvin Ridley, dude, has a 0.23 fantasy points per route run against cover 3 this season. That's bad. So this, and Chigakonkwo actually edges him at 0.26. So like, I'm okay saying that like Mason Rudolph, already a tight end, like likes to throw to tight end type quarterback in a good schematic matchup. I'm okay like taking a little bit of the uncertainty with Chigakonkwo against the ownership of Brenton Strange and just saying like, this is a 1v1 play and I'll just accept the little bit of additional variance here.
Yeah, really. I mean, you could basically build the cash game lineup and swap out Strange for Okonkwo and have a pretty decent tournament team there. So I do like that as a pivot off of the cheap tight end chalk. I think we covered just about everything here. We can move on to, I believe it's a 4-game afternoon slate. Minnesota at Seattle. Vikings are favored by 3. Total here is 42. No major injuries of note. Seattle completely healthy. Charbonnet, Walker, all expected to play. Ryan, this feels like it's a pretty solid shootout spot. I mean, no one wants to play Sam Darnold double stacks. He feels like a pretty solid tournament play. Both of these teams rank top 5 in pass rate over expectation. What are your thoughts on Darnold and the Viking side of this game?
Yeah, so first I want to say that there is some heavy rain forecasted for this game. So I think that's what's going into the total being a bit lower than we might have expected. But I mean, as always, just generally a good reminder with weather, that's always going to be factored into game totals, into projections. So it's important not to double count it. And with that in mind, if we want to take like a stacking approach to this game, yeah, I think Sam Darnold is pretty strong with no one wanting to play him. Schematically, the Seahawks have kind of been leaning into man coverage a lot more recently. Top 6 over the past 6 weeks in man coverage rate. And Darnold leads the NFL in yards per attempt against man coverage, 10.5 yards per attempt, 0.68 fantasy points per drop back. That ranks top 4, which is very impressive for a pocket passer. So yeah, we've seen Darnold be efficient when the Vikings are pushed. So if you want to lean into that assumption, I think it makes a lot of sense. Certainly Justin Jefferson has a massive ceiling as always. We've seen Jordan Addison kind of come on over the past 5 or 6 weeks, actually out targeting Jefferson over that span. But also pretty interestingly to me, and another guy no one wants to play is TJ Hawkinson, leads all tight ends with over 2.7 yards per out run against man coverage since the start of last season. Over the past couple games, we've seen Hawkinson get back up to a full-time-ish route share, 76%, then 78%, even with Josh Oliver back. So that just kind of suggests the team thinks he's a full go. He's totally over the ACL recovery. And if that's the case, just thinking back to last season and how Hawkinson was performing when he was healthy, he went over 16 DK in 5 of his 15 games, went over 25 a couple of times. Those are on par as rates with your George Kittles, with your Sam Laportas, like the star tight ends of that past season. So I think there is a ceiling here, and I'm pretty interested in Hawkinson, specifically in Darnold stacks as a member of a Darnold double.
Yeah, I think that's certainly an interesting way to play this. Hilo, really curious what you think about this game. Any interest in the Seattle side here? This is the cheapest DK Metcalf has been. He's only 5,500 since week 8 of 2019. There's also some coach speak suggesting they want to get him the ball more. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, there's two really big things that stand out on paper to me from this spot. Like, we have all the DK Metcalf stuff. How much of his recent performance is due to his nagging injuries? Like, since he came back, when he was injured, he missed the 2 games. Jackson Smith and Jigba's role fundamentally changed in the offense. They were using him in more upside inducing routes. We've talked about that before. So how much of this is just still a holdover of DK Metcalf being out, coming back, not being 100%? He's been on the injury report like ever since he came back. Because this guy did not just forget how to play good football, did not just forget how to run fast, did not just forget that he is 6'4" and 240 pounds, whatever the hell he is. I don't know exactly off the top of my head. Big dude, runs fast, is good at football. So to me, when you add the coach speak to that, there is definite upside here against a Minnesota defense that faces one of the highest rates of passing plays against. They face one of the highest pass volume against per game, and they're giving up deep passing. So DK Metcalf, in his new role in the offense, he's being utilized more. He's not getting the median, the smoothing out type stuff, which is going to JSN. So if he's being utilized downfield, the matchup kind of favors downfield work. There is upside in DK Metcalf, and if he's going to be fit, carry a fifth of the ownership of JSN, somewhere around there, I will have definite interest. The second thing that really stuck out to me here is the Vikings play action rate and the tendencies from the Seahawks against play action. With no play action, the Seahawks are effectively top 5 across the board in passing metrics on defense. Against the play action, they're bottom 5 across the board. So they have really struggled with play action. So if the Vikings can get Aaron Jones going early, if they can make the play action like a tool in their tool bag, and this is an offense that is utilizing play action at a top 5 rate as well. What stood out to me, though, in that research was that Jordan Addison has actually been the primary target at an inflated rate behind play action. His target rate against behind play action is somewhere around 36%. So that is better than Justin Jefferson. It's better than anybody on the team. So if that's the case, and they get this play action going against a defense that is struggling against play action, it becomes very clear to me that you can get a lot of upside from pairing DK Metcalf or JSN with a guy like Jordan Addison and not have to worry about the game environment turning into something or either of the quarterbacks. Yeah, I think that was a long roundabout way to get through that, but that's kind of where I'm looking at this game.
Yeah, I think that's a particularly sharp skinny stack call. And, I also think there's a decent amount of juice here with the overall game stacks. Although, as Ryan noted, total here is a little low. So not a game that I want to go totally overboard on. All right, I think we covered that pretty well. New England at Buffalo. Patriots are 14-point underdogs here. Total is 46.5. Curtis Samuel officially questionable with a rib injury. This is sort of a tricky game from a DFS perspective. Josh Allen has been a superhero in one-score games, almost 36 DraftKings fantasy points per game in one-score games, as opposed to 20.2 DraftKings fantasy points per game in all other games. But obviously, this isn't one of those games given the 14-point spread. Of course, Allen could go nuclear in the slim chance New England's able to push, or maybe he just decides he wants to. I just don't see a lot of juice here overall for fantasy. Obviously, it's very difficult to stack as well. Hilo, what are your thoughts on this game? Because it's a tough one.
Yeah, dude, we've talked about it in the past. Like, you kind of need something to force Josh Allen into superhero Josh. Like, that's what you're playing him for. And there's very little in that along that path for this game. So Josh is kind of he's out of my player pool this week. And it feels really weird to say that after he's set 2 NFL records over the last 3 weeks, but that's the truth of the matter. Even when you look at, like, with all the healthy bodies back, like with Dalton Kincaid back and with Keon Coleman back, like, they have now like 4 or 5 pass catchers that they'll use on a weekly basis. And they're not really giving James Cook like an elite workload. So betting on any of these guys is kind of difficult, man.
Yeah, it's really tough. Ryan, I'll throw it over to you. I know you had a little bit of interest in James Cook. I also think, you could argue there's some juice with Hunter Henry here, but, again, this game is pretty thin for fantasy.
Yeah, agreed pretty much on all counts. Cook is by far the player I have the most interest in, but again, this is like a 2% projected ownership running back play, kind of YOLO GPP type of thing. But I will say, with the Bills being 2 touchdown favorites, it's worth thinking about. Over 9 games since Joe Brady took over the offense, so going back to last year, we've seen James Cook average 22.6 DraftKings fantasy points per game in games that the Bills have won by multiple scores. He's gone over 28 DK in 3 of those 9 games, and he's averaging 1.4 rushing touchdowns per game in those spots this year. I think it's at least worth thinking about. Yes, the James Cook workload overall has been a lot worse over the past few weeks, but he's still averaging 3 red zone carries per game, even over the past 5 games, with the snap share overall coming down. That's still a top 12 mark at the position. With the Bills' own team total this high, I'm pretty interested, right? The Patriots have also been very vulnerable to running backs in the red zone and at the goal line this year, allowing the 3rd highest rushing touchdown conversion rate within 5 yards of the goal line. Over 60% of the time, they're just letting up the touchdown when the ball gets handed off. So I like Cook basically just for that, I need to instantly make a lineup super unique, and this is a guy who can score multiple touchdowns. Probably one of the most likely running backs on the slate to score multiple touchdowns. It's just, where does the rest of it come from that gives me pause. I really don't have much interest at all anywhere else in this game. Hunter Henry is fine in theory. But yeah, it's just tough to get excited about.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can argue, and this is effectively what Scott did in his slate breakdown, which will be out tomorrow over on FantasyPoints.com. Henry is sort of the $4,200 to $4,300 version of, or $4,100 version of Trey McBride. At least 8 targets in 5 of Drake May's last 7 full games. So worth considering. He projects okay, but yeah, this is a really thin game for fantasy. I see a little bit of GPP upside with Cook. I'd be legitimately tempted if he was 6K, but at 7K, I don't really think I could get there. All right, San Francisco at Miami. San Francisco 1-point favorites. Miami was favored at a point. This also hovered around a pick 'em for a minute. Total here is 44.5. Injuries on the Miami side. Jalen Waddle is doubtful. Tyreek Hill is listed as questionable with a wrist/personal issue. Obviously, the wrist isn't something that will hold him out. Not really sure what the info is on the personal issues. So something to keep an eye on. On the San Francisco side, a couple of key defenders are both questionable, in Nick Bosa and Dre Greenlaw. Hilo, I think this is a pretty interesting game. Two Shanahan offenses going at it here. Obviously, plenty of potential for explosive plays with these teams. What's your read here? Because I'm still trying to figure this game out myself.
Yeah, I prefer skinnies as opposed because I think the field is going to get to both of these quarterbacks. I think Tua is going to garner some ownership. I think Brock Purdy on the other side is going to garner ownership. But I really like pairing Tyreek Hill because we look at like what that offense is now, and we expect the 49ers to play a ton of too high. The Dolphins already see a ton of too high offensively because teams just kind of make that adjustment so that they don't beat them deep, which has led to like now Mike McDaniel reacting, and that's why Jonnu is a thing now over the last 5 weeks. That's why Devon A. Chan has seen such a consistent pass game workload because they're just using that because they can't run the football. They're just using those short to intermediate passes as an extension of the run and against too high. So it then becomes like, is there upside if the Dolphins are forced to kind of march the field because they're not able to throw deep because they have offensive line issues and the pressure and all the things that come together? Like, I'm looking at this matchup, they're probably going to have to like string together some drives here. So to me, that like there can still be upside in that setup, but it's a little bit less likely that the Dolphins are able to like exert pressure on the 49ers in this spot. And we talked about it with Sean McVay. Like, Kyle Shanahan's the same thing. He's not gonna say like, oh, I'm on my 4th running back. Okay, I'm just gonna throw the football like everywhere, and we're gonna go steal this game away, and we're gonna like snatch victory. Like, no, he's probably gonna come with a run balanced approach. They're going to probably throw the football 28 to 32 times like they do, and they're going to look to make those in-game adjustments and outmaneuver one of his like friends and proteges and cut from the same cloth type coach in Mike McDaniel. So we have 2 coaches here that are like chess masters of the field, and they're not looking to be like this brute force type. We're going to just go out and steal the victory. So Tyreek Hill stands out within that discussion because Jalen Waddle's out and because like the 49ers have been susceptible to deep passing. A lot of that has been due to injuries. They have Hufanga back, which is another thing. Like, this 49ers team is not typically a team that we're looking to attack with tight ends. And now they have Hufanga back. So how viable is Jonnu? That kind of goes into the equation as well. But Tyreek Hill stands out. George Kittle stands out. And these are like per target upside guys. And Juwan Jennings is way too cheap for his role.
I'm in a pretty similar spot as you. I do think, Patrick Taylor is a little bit interesting to talk about. Obviously, all the running backs this week that profile is really strong plays are sort of in that 7K range. And then there's Saquon Barkley, who's a little bit more expensive. We really don't have a ton of strong values at the running back position. If this was Isaac Guerendo at 5,200, I think everybody would be pretty excited to play him. There's just a little bit of uncertainty. I believe it's Izzy Abanaconda will be working in as well there. Hilo, do you have any interest in Patrick Taylor in like larger field tournaments? Because that feels to me like the spot to play him potentially. I mean, I don't want a ton of exposure, but what are your thoughts?
Not really.
Okay.
It might look like he has a lot of leverage just based on like his ownership is expected to be far lower than we feel like it should be. But we have to realize like there are many paths to him failing.
Yeah.
1, the game environment could go south. 2, we could just see them lean a little bit more pass heavy. 3, like we could just see these guys trading blows and it become a chess match. So I prefer getting leverage at the position by paying up twice instead of looking to pay down.
Yeah. Certainly think that makes a lot of sense. Ryan, what are your thoughts on this game? Anything to add after what Hilo said?
Yeah, I think Hilo did a good job of covering most stuff in this game. I guess I do just want to add on. I think I'm more optimistic about Jonnu Smith than either of you guys are. Going back to the discussion of expecting the 49ers, yes, to shift to too high, kind of like every team does against the Dolphins, that obviously would benefit Smith. But even if they don't, very interestingly to me, the 49ers have been more single high heavy over the past month, but a lot of that has come in the form specifically of cover 3. And Jonnu Smith has been awesome against even cover 3. over 3 yards per out run against cover 3, higher than Tyreek Hill. So the way I kind of looked at this from a schematic perspective is that all roads lead to Jonnu Smith. Like either the 49ers do what they've been doing for the past month, and that benefits Jonnu, or they do what every team does against the Dolphins, and that still benefits Jonnu. So that's kind of where I'm at. I'm just leaning more into Jonnu over Tyreek. But I do certainly hear you. I think if this game goes off, I do think Tyreek has to be involved somehow. Because it's pretty hard to imagine these teams really getting into like a track meet with just the short stuff to Achane and to Jonnu and what have you.
Yeah, certainly warrants mention. I mean, obviously Tyreek Hill isn't the same guy that we saw last year, but in his 3 games without Jalen Waddle last year, 45% first read target share for Tyreek Hill, 12 targets per game, 23.3 expected fantasy points per game. So certainly some juice, at least in terms of the raw usage with Tyreek Hill. Don't think I have anything else to add here. Obviously, Juwan Jennings, a really strong value play. HiLo already mentioned that. Maybe we see a little bit more usage on the San Francisco side, concentrate around the passing game. So I think you could argue for, some Purdy stacks based on that. Certainly not my favorite path, but one you can take. All right, we can move on to our last game here. Jacksonville Jaguars at the Las Vegas Raiders. This game is clean from an injury perspective. Jags are 2-point underdogs. Total here is 40.5. Hilo, I want to start with the Raiders side because I think this is pretty interesting. Aiden O'Connell looking at the single softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing quarterbacks. Obviously, no Sincere McCormick. This team really can't run, especially if you exclude the games where Sincere McCormick played. So this feels like a pretty interesting spot for O'Connell. I feel like if we had gotten this spot 3 weeks ago, he would have been pretty chalky here. This week, projecting for less ownership than Dorian Thompson-Robinson, who is, objectively pretty terrible. I certainly have some interest in O'Connell doubles. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've been going back and forth with O'Connell this week. He is like him being under center definitely benefits Jacoby Myers, definitely benefits Brock Bowers. I don't know if he has the upside that we're looking for in GPPs. He might, and I just might be wrong. I don't see myself going there when he's at 5,100 and you got guys like Caleb Williams that are only like 400 or 500 more. That's just my read on the situation, but I would not fault you if you were going to bet on this game environment, running Aiden O'Connell doubles, and it has to be Brock Bowers, it has to be Jacoby Myers, and then bringing it back with Brian Thomas Jr., bringing it back with Brenton Strange. Like, I wouldn't argue against that, just because if you're framing it through a game environment bet, there's really no clearing away top game environment on the slate. Like, we have a lot of games with pretty wide range of outcomes, and that's when it's okay to like take these shots on Aiden O'Connell doubles with Brian Thomas Jr. when nobody is. So yeah, I won't argue against it. I will not be going there myself. Maybe I need to rethink it. Maybe I need to revisit that, and maybe I'll get there. But it's kind of how I'm viewing the spot.
Yeah, I certainly think that's fair. Also, can't believe Derek Brown's comment. He said, I don't know if I can take anything here seriously when no one here is wearing a backwards trucker hat. Derek, I wore a Santa hat. It's the holidays. I mean, come on, man. You got to take us seriously when I'm in a Santa hat here. Ryan, on the Jags side.
You're not even a real fantasy podcast if you don't have backwards trucker hat.
Yeah, exactly. On the Jaguars side here, Brian Thomas Jr. profiles as a pretty solid play. Brenton Strange obviously profiles as a really fantastic value, averages 6.2 targets per game and 10.9 fantasy points per game without Evan Ingram. Those marks would rank 7th best and 8th best at the position. Obviously not quite price like it. Mac Jones also career 21% tight end target rate, which would rank 6th best among current starters, and Brenton Strange gets a top 5 positional matchup. I think he's pretty clearly the cash tight end. Really, I'm curious on your thoughts on BTJ here. I was kind of always a little skeptical of his upside with Mac Jones. Obviously, he proved me wrong last week. What are your thoughts on BTJ before we get out of here?
Yeah, I'm pretty interested, I'll be honest. The Raiders have had kind of a lot of trouble getting pressure this year, and we've seen some pretty significant pressure splits for Mac Jones over his career and also for Brian Thomas Jr. over his career. Yards per out run about doubles when his quarterback is not pressured. Also with BTJ, worth noting is that they started using him kind of in this design target and screen role. I don't have the number in front of me. It might have been 7 design targets last week. So that's great. Like it helps the floor. It lets him do stuff after the catch. The Raiders have been pretty tough against the deep ball. I guess that's kind of the one thing like weighing on my Brian Thomas Jr. optimism a little bit. But yeah, it's become a very concentrated offense. Thomas and Strange combined for over a 70% first read target share last week. So I do think you can go here as a game environment that I don't know if I'm willing to go to the Mac Jones doubles. I might have to do a little playing around to see how that kind of builds out. But yeah, I think very similarly to the other side of this game, we have just two pieces on each side that I think project pretty well. So yeah, I do think it's something I want to get into. I'm excited about this game, about the pieces in this game.
Yeah, certainly think that's fair. And I will note before we get out of here that whenever you have a game or a team where, two pass catchers are projecting as strong values, I don't think I can ever fault you for playing the quarterback and just rolling with the double stack. That was something that we saw last week in the DraftKings Fantasy World Championships, the big live final where we saw, tons of sharp players played Mac Jones doubles, played Aaron Rodgers doubles, maybe not necessarily because they were in love with those quarterbacks, but just because, those double stacks projected particularly well, especially among those pass catchers. So I think that's worth noting when, we are experimenting with, a bit of a lackluster game environment in terms of stacks. But all right, guys, that will do it for the Week 16 edition of Cashing Points. Really appreciate everybody for tuning in, and we will see you all at the top of the leaderboards.
What? Why are you shaking your head?
You're welcome.